hello everyone, I am Madeleine Avernot. I'm from the LIAM laboratory in Montpellier in France. And together with the Neuron Consortium, so it's a European consortium, we are working on oscillatory neural networks. And in particular with partners in Paris from AI Emergence, we are working on applications for oscillatory neural networks. And this work is about SIFT ONN, so SIFT feature detection algorithm employing ONNs for edge detection. And so first, I'm going to describe what are oscillatory neural networks, or ONNs. So oscillatory neural networks take inspiration from the brain oscillations that are used for collective coordinations. And basically, we use the same principle of collective coordination between oscillators to compute. So an oscillatory neural network is like a network of coupled oscillators. So each neuron is an oscillator coupled with like another component that represents like the weight and the synapse of your neural network. And how we compute? We compute by using a phase computing paradigm. So we encode the information in the phase relationship between the oscillators. And there is like a physical phenomenon that exists that says, if you couple two oscillators, they will tend to stabilize in phase. And so if we can configure the coupling between our oscillators, we can choose if they will be in phase or out of phase. And this is basically how we compute. So we can configure our network, the synapses of our network, and then initialize the network like the phases of the oscillators so they can evolve and stabilize to the desired output depending on the coupling. So usually the oscillatory neural networks are used for auto-associative memory or pattern recognition like Hopfield networks. So if you couple all your oscillators together, then you can memorize patterns inside your coupling by using unsupervised Hebbian learning. And so when you input like a corrupted pattern, then it will evolve in time and stabilize to one of the memorized patterns. The issue with this is that it uses a lot of synapses because it's fully connected. And so we are trying to get to go beyond this behavior of oscillatory neural networks. And so to go beyond and to explore different architectures, we developed an implementation of the ONN inside an FPGA. So it's a proof of concept to explore applications. And inside the project, there are other partners that are more developing like devices, emerging devices for oscillatory neural networks and circuits for analog ONNs. But in this case, we use digital implementation, so with digital oscillators and registers as synapses. And so we can see here, like if we want to scale a little bit up the network from like 15 neurons to 60 neurons, the number of resources required and the number of synapses is increasing a lot. So we are really exploring like to go beyond this. And one solution we found is like to look more into conventional like artificial intelligence with layered architecture. And we started with 2 layers first, and we were able to reproduce like to replace convolutional filters with a 2-layer ONN. So to perform image edge detection. So how is it normally done? You have 2 convolutional filters that scan the image to define like at each point on the image if you have an edge or not. And so we used these 2 convolutional kernels to configure a 2-layer network. So basically you have a first layer with 3x3 that takes information from the image. And you have a second layer with 2 neurons that detects if there is an edge or not. And so we did it with bidirectional connections and feed-forward connections, because using the digital implementation, we can perform feed-forward connection, but for most of the analog implementation, sometimes we are constrained with bidirectional connections. And so looking a little bit at the result of this application, so we were having the same accuracy and precision in terms of image detection as the Sobel algorithm, which is the one we saw with the previous convolutional kernels. And if we compare the 2 solutions, one with the bidirectional and one with the feed-forward, the bidirectional issue is that it takes more time to compute. Why? Because you don't have a fixed input, like the input will evolve in time as well. So it takes more time to compute, and it requires more resources. So if we want to implement like a chip for image edge detection, we need to use like more than 1 ONN. But in this case, we can implement less in parallel than with the feed-forward. And so it takes more time to compute if we consider like a chip for image edge detection. And so another solution to increase the speed and the latency, because it's one issue with image edge detection, is instead of like scanning the image with a stride of 1, you scan the image with a stride of the size of a filter. But then it impacts also the precision, because you can lose like some detection of edges, but then it depends on your application and what you want to do with it. And so we went a little bit beyond this application to see like, can we use this for something else more meaningful than just image edge detection? And this is thanks to the partners, so AI Emergence in Paris, they are developing a robot for safety and security in office. So basically the robot navigates in the office to detect intrusions and water leakage and different things. And so in robotic navigations, feature detection is often used to like detect features in different frames of the image. And by matching the features, you can have the movement of the robot, and it helps for navigation. And so we looked at this problem, and it turns out like the state of the art for robotic application is orb feature detection, because it's really fast. But there are other algorithms like the SIFT, RISC, or others that are like better in precision, but slower. And so they are not used for embedded system because they are too slow. So we wanted to see, can we use like ONN in one of these to maybe speed up the process? Yep. Sorry. And okay, and so the SIFT feature detection algorithm, basically the first step of the SIFT is called a difference of Gaussian. And if you look at the output of a difference of Gaussian, it really resembles like the output of an image edge detection. So we thought like maybe we can just replace this part of the SIFT algorithm with our ONN edge detection, and maybe it will help and speed up the process. So this is what we did. And we showed that, so it's applied for image relocation, but we showed that we were able to speed up the SIFT algorithm using ONN as like an accelerator instead of the difference of Gaussian with the image edge detection, but we also decreased a lot the precision. So this is currently the state of our results with the SIFT ONN. And next, of course, we would like to improve the results. So maybe we could have the same latency, but with higher accuracy. And to do so, we have one main idea is, so the main difference between the difference of Gaussian and our ONN edge detection is that the ONN gives black and white outputs, what the difference of Gaussian gives like grayscale outputs with like more, like some edges are more important than the others. And so we are exploring how to have output like grayscale output with ONN, which is not so simple. And then we would like also to perform other like tasks, because we focused on image relocation, but with feature detection, there is also other tasks like image occlusion and so on. And then, so this work was like a first work like to go beyond this fully connected architecture with like a 2-layer architecture. And so we would like to explore also multi-layer architecture, and to do so, we are looking into different learning algorithms, because we believe that using the unsupervised Hebbian is not helpful if you want to do really multi-layer like architecture. And so we are looking more into like equilibrium, this kind of learning algorithms. And we hope it will help us to also use ONN for other more complex maybe applications. So thank you for your attention. If you have any question.
All right, we'll be taking any questions. Okay.
So have you also thought about encoding delays in the connections or non-linearities?
Can you repeat?
Either delays in the connections between the oscillators or non-linearities in the connection, because it could encode a richer set of behaviors.
Yeah, so for the moment, no. And we are thinking about it for this grayscale. I think I discussed already with someone here about it. But the thing is how to implement it then inside the synapse. And this, for the moment, we don't have any clue. So inside the digital, we could implement it. But if we are thinking about the analog, then it's another challenge. So yeah, thanks.
So on the speed constraints of this, is that mainly because of how the amount of time you have to wait for the cycles to align with each other?
You mean on the speed of the time required to
Yeah.
here? Yeah, so this is the time for all the neurons to stabilize to a stable state. So we can measure the phase and consider this is the output.
Can you like cut that down just by increasing the cycle frequency, or is that?
Yeah, but this frequency is the maximum we can get on this FPGA. But if you can go faster with the oscillators, you can go faster for your computation. Yeah.
Okay, cool. Is that like something that, I don't know, is like a hardware constraint, or is that like something that people are looking into?
Yeah, I think when people develop the oscillators, they really look into the frequency because they know that the computation will depend on the frequency.
Cool. Thank you.
Yeah, really cool to see oscillators doing image edge detection. I think that's super impressive, and we're happy to see oscillators implemented. Is there any other tasks that you might expect to be really natively suitable to oscillators? Because there's a wide, and they seem so dynamic and so embedded in time. I could imagine there really being certain types of computations that they're just really made to do. I'm just curious what else might be on the horizon there.
So in terms of other tasks, there is a huge community looking into graph optimization problems. So I don't know if you remember, I think it was on Tuesday, we had like a talk about spiking for graph optimization problem with MaxCut. And there is a lot of research looking into like ONN for this kind of problems. And they show that pretty cool results on this. And then for dynamical systems, you mentioned, I think there are some works on reservoir computing as well with the oscillators that are really cool as well.
All right, let's thank our speaker again.
Thank you.
Right, our next speaker is John Zegom Pedersen from KTH Real Institute of Technology. I'll let you get set up here. Looking good. The contrast is not so great. And he'll be talking about event-based object tracking.
I think it's relevant for a lot of people here in the community. So I'm hoping to talk to a lot of you about this later as well. But the problem really started out a bit more than a year ago. We wanted to learn some very, very, very simple vision problem. And what you see here are some geometric shapes moving around. And it should be relatively straightforward to take a spiking network and train it to recognize the positions of these objects. Turned out it wasn't. So we used conventional methods from deep learning and computer vision, ported them over, and it just didn't work. Right? And as a poor PhD student, I tried to really get an intuition of what was going on. Why did it not work? That's what I really want to talk about today, because the kernels we kind of got from our convolutional networks look like this, completely useless, and there wasn't really a lot of information to figure this out. That's a backhanded part of deep learning. It's very difficult to open these black boxes up. So what we've been doing is really understanding event-based object tracking from a more foundational perspective. What does it mean to operate with these sparse signals? Because we are specifically working with event-based cameras and spiking models. What I'll try to carry you through is kind of what insights we gained from diving into the traditional literature and how that ports over. So my name is Jens Pedersen. I work with Raghav and Jörg in KTH Stockholm. We work on neurorobotics or neurocomputing in general. So we care deeply about real time. There's another guy in KTH called Tony Lindeberg who's been working with scale-space theory in conventional computer vision. It's a massive topic, actually, because it's incredibly ubiquitous. So if you look at this particular device, I think it's a kind of phone, probably, and you imagine looking at it from different scales. So I look at it very up close, I go a bit further back. If I use the same, let's say, receptive field or attention area of interest, then that element, that object, looks very, very different from different scales. So it's a quite obvious, intuitive explanation. But the point is that if you want to recognize that phone, right, you need to have something called invariance. You need to be invariant to the fact that you can transform, you can scale your picture. So whether or not you apply some transformation f to your picture, right, you should actually still detect whether that is really the phone that you're looking for. So that's really the foundation of the scale space theory. Quite intuitional, but actually brings some very interesting insights. What you see here is a very, very, very classic convolution. You probably all know this very well. On the x-axis, you have time, space in our case. You move along. You track some kind of a signal. In this case, it could be a spike from an event camera. And the orange G is then your kernel. So in our case, a Gaussian that moves ahead. And in the bottom, you see what happens when you convolve those two signals. You get this kind of response field. And so a previous talk mentioned how you can consider some of these signals as a probability of some hypothesis being there. And that's really how much I think about these convolutions, because it lets us match for that shape of your kernel, right? We can, with that kernel, scan through the image, and the bottom graph will tell us what is the probability, what's the likelihood that we actually see that pattern in our signal. And what scale space theory have been doing is that you can then take your Gaussian and squish it in. And that will select for a different kind of pattern. So again, not when we present it like this, it's kind of intuitive, but it's wildly important, because coming back to our case before, now we can, with different kinds of receptive fields, like if we just change the variance of the Gaussian, we detect different kinds of signals. And so what that gives us is actually receptive fields, if you will, or kernels that can be invariant to these scaling operations, because your receptive field will change with scale. Like the receptive field for a small phone will be different than the receptive field for a large phone. And by combining all these receptive fields together, you get these very nice mathematical invariance properties. So this actually covers scale invariance, but also translational invariance, because convolutions are just by definition invariant to transformations, or translations, sorry. Yeah. What Lindeberg has been working on specifically is how you can demonstrate guarantees for different types of signal in space. And what that means specifically is that we don't care necessarily in computer vision about one dimension, we need to care about two dimensions. So we need to capture these different signals. So a very crude object detector will match certain patterns of event in two-dimensional space. If you want to match that, we need a corresponding receptive field. We need a corresponding pattern matcher. Right? And the way this works, here's a paper from 2021 that actually parameterizes these receptive fields or two parameters. If you're in the middle of the circle here, you have a completely symmetric Gaussian blob. As you move towards the edge, you parameterize the skew or the covariance matrix, the ratio of your covariance matrix, basically. And with the angle, you can parameterize the rotation. So you can change the rotation of your receptive field. And this turns out to work really, really, really well. And what you see in the first line in this graph is really just some samples of this circle I showed you before, which you can discretize and put into a very conventional convolutional neural network. And the reason why it works really well is because you can start to do spatial derivatives of this. And by doing that, you actually select from very complicated structures. So for those of you familiar with this, is very close to Gabor filters or actually frequency analysis, because you can start to understand some of these spatial patterns in a more abstract way. But it's very, very cool because this is very similar to what happens in biological vision systems, because they do exactly the same. When you have these patterns, these Gabor filters, these derived Gaussians are just exactly what you need. There's a lot of mathematical theory on this dating back to the 1930s that shows this is the case. But I'm excited about this because it means that we can actually provide some specific guarantees. We can really demonstrate mathematical properties for our spiking convolutional event-based object tracking network. So one is that we have linearity properties guaranteed between these Gaussian derivatives. And what this just means is we're not throwing away signal. We can also guarantee translation invariance and scale invariance. And this might sound rudimentary, but it's actually quite cool that we can demonstrate this specifically, because this is pretty much the backbone of conventional computer vision. And with this, we can more or less like satisfy spatial features. So this is probably not new to many of you, but I want to reiterate it because it pertains to another important point we are faced with in this community, which is how do we deal with time, right? Great, we capture spatial features. How do we deal with time? And my argument really is that it's not enough to have invariance in the spatial domain. You also need invariance in the temporal domain. Furthermore, because we're a real-time lab, we really care about real-time predictions. So we're very, very happy to talk about models that work stepwise, that really have a very close relation to computation and time without any averaging or other shenanigans like that. Right? So I want to take one step back and think a bit about events more foundationally. What you see here is a chaotic pendulum recorded with an event camera. And these models and algorithms working with these kind of struggle to keep up with conventional methods, unfortunately still. So if you think about a single frame of this video, I can see why, because there's not a lot of signal here, actually. Now, the contrast is particularly bad on the screen, but it can actually be difficult to elicit these features if you just work with pure frames like you do in conventional computer vision. So we need some form of spatial temporal integration to form some intuition, like over time, what happens, what is our signal, not just in the spatial domain, but also stretched in time. And we also need some predictions in millisecond predictions. So we need like very, very rapid inferences. So let's go back to talk a bit about, there we go, our convolutions. As we saw before, this is a signal, F, the blue bar. Now, stop imagining space, but imagine time. So you can take a single pixel in your event camera and imagine that at some point in time, that pixel will emit an event. Right? But your Gaussian kernel can still process that signal in time. That's just not how we do it in leaky integrated fire networks or leaky integrated networks. We have some kind of exponential kernel that convolves this signal. So actually, simulating a spike neural network corresponds to just running this kernel in time, more or less, if you imagine this one pixel lighting up. And what's really cool about that is that you can do the same scaling trick in time. Because by changing the time constant of your decay, you simply get a different response function. So the bottom here basically selects for the same signal, but at different scales. There are a few details here that's very cool to mention. One of them is there's actually an extension to the Gaussian notion, which is also causal, meaning that we're not looking ahead in time. We're only operating what's available to us in the present and in the past. Right? We're not looking into the future. So this is perfectly aligned with our simulations. But what this specifically lets us do is to create temporal heat maps. So we can now do instantaneous predictions because all of our neurons are basically coding for spatiotemporal time that decays in the temporal domain. So if you imagine back to our very crude rudimentary stimulus, we have some circles and triangles moving around in space. We can create kind of temporal heat maps in leaky integrators that select for these specific spatiotemporal patterns, and then use that heat map to predict average activities in the X and the Y domain. We use Frobenius norms, but basically just trying to find where the average activity is on both axes, and then use that as a prediction. That's pretty cool because we can read out coordinates every single frame. We don't have to wait for anything. We can just, every time we get new information, we read out the coordinate. But it's also differentiable because we can take the activation immediately from each pixel and feed it back through the network so that we can train, for instance, with gradient-based methods. And that's what I want to talk about briefly, what we actually then did, because everything is good and well in theory, but how does this work in practice? So coming back to our data set briefly, we took these videos that is completely simulated. So it's very artificial data. It's not very pretty, but it does the job of us completely controlling the settings. We can move these things around with some Brownian motion and ensure randomness and fairness. And we can generate a lot of data points. And then we can sample our shapes from a Bernoulli distribution. So we sample with very, 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 very high probability, so 80% in the entire space. And the reason for that is that this gives us basis for comparison with ANNs, just to see, compared to conventional methods, how does this work? Our model then leverages the fact that we have these scale spaces. So we have 4 different spaces, if you will, with different scaling. So that's where we really guarantee the scaling invariance. Otherwise, it's a very standard convolutional network that at the end uses this differentiable coordinate transform to generate our heat map so we can get coordinates out of our network. There's not much trick to it, apart from the fact that we need quite beefy GPUs to train these models well, but it turns out it works surprisingly well. And so if you move on to our results here, what you see is that, first of all, ANN and SNNs perform on par in this example. I think that's quite cool because there's no tricks involved. Like, we're trying to be very, very fair. So the top row here is the artificial neural networks with ReLU activation units, and the bottom row is the same network architecture, but with leaky integrate and fire activation units. And if we uniformly initialize everything, so forget about the receptive fields. Like, both models actually kind of solve the problem. However, if we then introduce the receptive fields, the spiky neural network actually responds quite well to that because of the temporal integration, which is tremendously fascinating. There's a lot more work to be done in understanding exactly why, feeding back to the theory I mentioned before. But the point is that the artificial neural network does not benefit from it. That completely makes sense because by adding these receptive fields, we're essentially locking the early layers in our model, preventing the ANNs to learn. And they have perfect gradients, right? So they can just flow without any problems. We're using surrogate gradient methods. So there are bound to be some information and gradient constraints. And so with this method, we can really control for that. Just as a side note, this also, by the way, speeds up training by a factor of 2 because we can basically lock a lot of the gradients in the network. So that's quite significant. We're quite pleased with this very preliminary results. I think what's also important to notice is that in these error plots, what you see here is that the average errors, these are 20 percentile control lines here. The average area is not more than like 4 or 5 pixels on average. And that's a quite reasonable accuracy if you imagine you run this in real time. And it is really running in real time, because if you do inference with this in forward mode, you can get this to stream a DVS camera using A-stream into a GPU, and then have roughly a frequency of 1,000 hertz, right? So you really have millisecond response times. And it takes you roughly one tick, so 1 millisecond, to go through the whole model. So this is a response time of roughly 4 to 5 milliseconds. So Jason mentioned SNN torch. We've worked on a different neuron simulator called Norris, but basically it's the very same principle. We build a few differential equations on top of the PyTorch machine learning ecosystem. So this is not really we shouldn't get credit for accelerating like this. That's because PyTorch has been doing so much tremendously good work on making this work in real time. So there's not much to say about the math on this that I'd love to talk more about, but I also want to give time to questions. So I slowly want to start to wrap up. And one thing that's important to mention is that there are a few limitations, namely that we're not working with real data. We're aware of that, and that's a very conscious choice, because we really wanted to control for these very simple, in a sense, mathematical properties, and then we can always scale. We're working on putting this into a real DVS camera setting. This is also only working on GPUs, and it will be obvious to put this onto Spinnaker, for instance, with the Spinnaker interface board we've been developing, because this streams very, very neatly into the neuromorphic setting I talked about a few days ago, where you have complete parallelization, right? There's no central synchronization here at all. It's completely neuromorphic. This is also only guaranteeing translation and scale. I'm working on extending this to other properties like rotation and skew or shear, and that will be, I think, much more interesting for real-world optic detection setting, obviously, because that's properties that appear in the real world. So to summarize, we found that SNNs actually rival ANNs, which I think is also a quite neat result. And one caveat to mention is that we have extremely high data density, and we did that to be fair to the ANNs, because event data is much, much, much more sparse. Like some of the data sets, like the DVS test data, I think it's around 6% or so, less than that. So I have a strong intuition that ANNs will fall short when we actually work with real event data, for obvious reasons. It's also, we added differentiable coordinate transform for spiking networks, and that's a pretty neat technology because it works in real time. And I really think this is a nice way to achieve real-time vision processing with events, because you can train it to do anything. So this works with conventional computer vision approaches, and conventional computer vision has done a tremendously good job in solving almost any vision processing scenario. So I'm eager to start working on this with many other interesting problems. So with that, I actually want to thank you for your time. I talked about translation and scale invariance, and I'm very curious to hear how this scales to your problem. I just want to very quickly thank my colleagues at KTH, specifically Juan, Emil, and Harini, for awesome talks and collaborations. And also, of course, the funding and my supervisor, Jörg. Thank you for your attention.